Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 5th episode of the Manor Podcast. I'm your co-host, Roger Bodee, and I'm joined, as always, with my best friend and other co-host, Michael Hamilton. Michael, how's life going?
It was a little bit better the first time we did this, but I'm doing all right.
I just enjoyed doing the podcast so much, I just needed to do it again. So I guess for context to this opening, Michael and I recorded a whole podcast on Tuesday evening, June 21st, and I made the foolish mistake of trusting a MacBook to host my recording files. And once we were done, my MacBook turned off and decided to never turn on again, and we lost the audio recording. So we're now re-recording yesterday's topic, but this time it'll be even better the second time.
Yeah, we learned a bit the first time we did it, so that is the bright side. We get to improve how we present this information, and
Yeah, so today's topic, we'll be going over the initial builds of how we envision Fi, Dromai, and Icelander, the new Uprising heroes, to be first built and classic constructed. After we discuss some of their deck building options and why we think their initial lists are constructed in the way they are, we'll go over the classic constructed meta as a whole and pick our heroes in a tier list and try to see where each hero in the new Uprising classic constructed will fall based on our thoughts and expectations.
All right, shall we jump right into it?
Yeah, so I think first off we're starting with Fi.
Yeah, so Fi is a Draconic Ninja with a very interesting ability where he starts with a Phoenix Flame in his graveyard, and once per turn, he can return a Phoenix Flame from his graveyard to his hand, and it costs 3 resources at the start, but it costs 1 less for each Draconic chain link he controls. So ideally with Fi, you're looking to recur this Phoenix Flame, hopefully for free every turn, or most turns, and you're using that to extend your already long chains and put out a lot of damage. It also works well with his Mask of Momentum. Giving him longer chains means it's more likely you'll have 3 attacks in a row hit to draw a card off the Mask of Momentum. And the Tiger Stripe Shuko that says the second attack action with 2 or less base power each turn gets +1 power. When building the deck, we're looking to have long chains to threaten Mask Momentum, to maximize Fi's ability, and also to enable the Tiger Stripe Shuko's ability to get +1 damage.
Right, and as you can be expected from that, it's going to be a very red-heavy deck with 50 reds in the list.
So some of these reds will be boarded out in most matchups. You probably can't play only 10 non-red cards and have a functional curve, especially given that his weapon, the Searing Ember Blade, costs 2 resources to attack, and it attacks for 3, and as long as you have 2 or more Draconic Chain Links counting itself, it gets go again. So it's going to be a powerful tool in both enabling his hero ability of returning the flames and also helping build up those longer chains to threaten the Mask of Momentum triggers. So I think we're going to want to play a reasonable amount of blues into most matchups, probably somewhere in the 15 to 20 range. There are 20 in this list, but I imagine you could board some of them out in the more aggressive mirrors. And you can also rely on Belittle a little bit to help find those blues you need with tutoring up Minnowism.
Right, so that's the other interesting inclusion. I think up until this point, Chain has been really the only deck that's successfully implemented this Belittle Minnowism plan, but it's looking like Fi is also going to be able to utilize this strategy because he's also going to want to be able to tutor up resources in order to keep these really long combat chains going. And to that end, when you're having very long combat chains, one of the best cards in the game that has also seen a lot of success in Chain is Art of War. That's allowing all of your attacks for the entire turn when you're playing it to have +1 power.
Yeah, like we said in our top 10 episode, Art of War is very strong when you're looking to go very wide with a lot of attack actions, and Fi is definitely looking to do that, so it's a perfect fit in the deck. Other interesting points are the inclusion of 3 Ancestral Empowerments. This card doesn't really fit Fi strategy specifically of having a lot of attack actions to go wide, but the rate of just spending 0 resources and a card that replaces itself to give an attack action +1 is very powerful, and there are a few relevant on hits that it can push through.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just one of the best attack reactions in the game, and I think it's currently being a little overlooked in some builds of Fi, but I think it should just be considered a staple of every ninja class when they're constructing their decks. I guess if we're looking to our equipment a little bit, I'm seeing that we have both Flamescale Furnace and Findale's Spring Tunic as our chess piece options. Do you want to talk about when you're going to want one chess piece over the other?
Yeah, I think the default should be Flamescale Furnace. The fact that it blocks for 3 and you're an aggressive deck not looking to play really long games means it's going to be quite valuable in those fast aggressive mirrors, stop being relevant on hits, and your deck isn't particularly great at blocking. A lot of the cards in the deck block for 2, so having a chess piece that can help cover up that weakness a little bit is very nice. Fyendal Spring Tunic is there specifically for matchups that you expect to go long. like against Oldheim, against Icelander, even against Dromai perhaps, where you're looking to play longer games and you will get this resource off of it multiple times over the course of the game.
That definitely makes a lot of sense. And then the other interesting thing about the equipment that I'm seeing here is the inclusion of both Snapdragon Scalers and Tide Flippers. On their face, it just seems like Tide Flippers is basically doing the same thing as Snapdragon Scalers, but just strictly better with the Arcane Barrier. So are Snapdragon Scalers actually the default in this list?
I think so. There are a few cards that Tide Flippers does not hit that is interesting to give go again with the Snapdragon Scalers. The main one would be Breaking Point. Hands that have 2 breaking points that you want to end on. If they block out the first one, it could be very nice to use Snapdragon Scalers on it and just play a second one. It's also nice that it hits Blaze Headlong, which only has go again if you put another red card this turn. So being able to have a hand that normally wouldn't work because you're lacking that chain starter, being able to Snapdragon Scalers the Blaze Headlong is also quite nice. Tide Flippers is definitely a downgrade in that it only hits cards with base 2 or less power, but the Arcane Barrier seems like it could be pretty important in some spots. And I think Snapdragon Scalers is the weakest piece of equipment in Fi, so it makes sense to try to slot in the Arcane Barrier there in his boots.
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. And then when we're looking to sideboard options, you spoke to at the beginning that we're not always going to be playing all of these 50 reds in every matchup, which makes a lot of sense. The deck wouldn't be very functional at that rate. But what sideboard cards, aside from Thaw, are you envisioning to be important or impactful in certain matchups? Obviously, Thaw is going to be for against the Icelander, Oldheim, or Ice Lexis, where you're expecting those Ice Afflictions or Frostbites to be prevalent. But as far as the different configurations of this list, how do you expect it to be built when it's trying to be all in on aggro versus trying to be a little bit more adaptive?
I think your choice of finisher will depend on what you're playing against. I don't think you'll want 3 copies of Breaking Point and 3 copies of Lava Burst in every matchup. That's kind of a lot of finishers, especially if you're in a matchup where you might want to block sometimes, or a matchup where they're disrupting you enough and trying to do things to keep you from getting to Chainlink 4 or higher. It can be a lot to play 6 copies of this effect, or 6 copies of a finishing effect. So I'd look to board out one of those in a reasonable number of matchups.
That definitely makes a lot of sense. And is Brand with Cinderclaw there basically in the times that you want Belittle to also be a Draconic attack? Because I believe it's the only non-Draconic attack in the deck at the moment.
Yeah, Brand with Cinderclaw is just 3 for 0 with Go Again is a pretty good chain starter. We're even playing Ronin Renegade, which is just a strictly worse version of Brand with Cinderclaw. And the fact that it has synergy with Belittle, where you can play Brand into Belittle, and Belittle will then count as one of your Draconic actions, is just some nice upside on a card that you're probably happy to play in Fi anyway. 0 for 3 with Go Again. That is a Draconic Ninja action.
That makes sense. And then I guess this is kind of more of also like a high level question. So the Phoenix Flame that starts in Fi's graveyard count towards his 60 card deck limit. So he is technically able to present with the 1 Phoenix Flame in the graveyard and 59 cards in his deck from there at that point. Do you think it would be correct to play 59 cards, or do you still want to hit 60 cards plus the 1 Phoenix Flame in the graveyard?
No, there's not really an advantage from adding that 60th card to the deck, or 61st card if you could count the Phoenix Flame in your graveyard. I think it is almost always going to be correct to present 59, because the less cards you present, the more likely you are to draw any specific card in your deck, and presumably you're putting the 59 best cards in your deck for the matchup.
You probably put the 59 best cards in the deck in the matchup. I probably put in the 59 worst cards in the deck for the matchup, but that's just what separates good players from the rest of us. Okay, well, we'll definitely be sure to link the Fi list in our description and in the comments of whatever streaming platform you're listening to this to. We'd love your feedback, and we definitely expect Fi to be a very aggressive and premier deck in Uprising.
So, moving on, our next hero is Dromai, Ash Artist. She's a Draconic Illusionist hero with 40 life and 4 intellect. Whenever she pitches a red card, create an Ash token, and if you played a red card this turn, dragons you control have Go Again while attacking. While building Dromai, we are looking for ways to play a red card with Go Again so that we can attack with our dragons afterwards, and the dragons will all have Go Again. Commonly, you'll start the chain with one of the invokes, and then that fulfills the red requirement to give your dragons Go Again, and then you can play an invoke and then attack with all the dragons you have in play. But sometimes you'll also want to play some of her attack actions. One thing that I think is kind of tricky about Dromai is you need Ash, But if you're pitching red cards, you're not being very efficient with your turns. So I think it's important to make sure you have ways to create ash outside of pitching reds. Because if you're pitching a red every turn, you're just going to fall so far behind in value because it's just very inefficient. You're basically trading a card for one resource instead of trading a card for 3 resources that you'd get from pitching a blue.
Right, and that's why the overall curve of Dromai is very low to the ground, similar to Fi style. Like I said earlier, the Draconic decks are both looking to be very aggressive and maintain a lot of red, cheaper cost cards. So to that end, Dromai is just looking to utilize those, like you said, to get her go again ability. But also some of her key dragon reveals, specifically the legendary ones, require you to be revealing red cards off the top of your deck. But there's a catch-22 because those red dragons or the legendary dragons are pretty expensive to be casting. So once again, there becomes an awkward dichotomy of maintaining the right ratio of red and blue cards in your deck to be able to both play the game and satisfy the red draconic elements that these heroes are wanting to have in their deck. Interestingly though, Dromai is playing the draconic legendary resource Blood of the Drakai because she is more often going to be able to utilize its effect of the cost reduction after it's being pitched, whereas Fi and his deck is so pseudo Cheerio based almost to the point where it's going to be more difficult for him to actually utilize that cost reduction on the cards that he's playing. So it's interesting that it is finding a home in one of the draconic heroes, but not both.
Blood of the Drakai, being able to pitch for one of your 1 costs and then follow it up with more 1 cost attacks or even 1 cost invokes in the case of Miragi or Kyloria, is very powerful. And then also being able to get an Ash off pitching a card that essentially is going to function like a blue a lot of the time in your Dromai hands. Being able to pitch a card for around 3 resources and get an Ash is quite a nice deal. So that was enough that I think Blood of the Drakai is going to be quite good in Dromai.
And also, since we're so red heavy, we're currently playing Ravenous Rabble because it's going to be often just a 0 for 4 go again, satisfying Dromai's requirement for playing red card during the turn. But it also helps you set up those legendary dragons, as I said before, because you can set up situations where you attack with Ravenous Rabble and ensure that there's a red card on top of your deck before committing to invoking the Dominia or Tumultai cards that are looking to have those cards on top of your deck.
It's really powerful to know that your top card isn't red or is red before you play the Invoke Dominia, because if you play Dominia and then attack and reveal a blue card off of it or a yellow card, then you're not getting that effect where you get to look at their hand and get rid of a card. And that's something that could be very game deciding, leaving them with an extra card versus not, especially if it happens to be a popper that would kill Dominia just from blocking.
Absolutely. Interestingly, the only card we're playing 9 copies of is Sweeping Blow, just because it's going to be that important to ensure that you're generating these Ash tokens to constantly be creating Aether Ash Wings.
Yeah, I think Sweeping Blow is the premier attack action in Dromai. 1 for 3 with Go Again is not a very good rate at all, but getting that Ash token in a way that is much more efficient than just pitching a red is something you're very happy about. We're still playing 12 blues in the deck, and a lot of the time our turn is going to be starting with playing Billowing Mirage, pitching a blue, and then doing something else with the extra 2 resources afterwards.
And I'm really happy that we're finally finding a home for Fractal Replication. When that card was first spoiled in Everfest, I think everybody had the initial expectation that it was just going to be bonkers in Prism. That really didn't end up being the case because Prism's illusionist attacks wound up leaving the combat chain either through being popped through their Phantasm ability, or even when they weren't popped and did hit, they would leave the combat chain because they would be placed into Prism Soul. So that left Fractal Replication in this awkward spot where there really weren't a lot of good attacks for it to mimic on the combat chain, but it does a really good job of following up all of these draconic illusionist attack actions that hopefully will be staying around on the combat chain and not being popped.
I think Fractal Replication is a card you might cut some copies of in some matchups if they have a lot of poppers, or even if the meta is like kind of hostile towards it, it might not end up being correct to play it. The upside of being able to play Sweeping Blow off of a blue and then follow it up with a higher power illusionist attack action with Go Again, and then doing a Fractal Replication to both get that Ash token from copying Sweeping Blow's ability and also getting that higher power from the other illusionist attack action you play. That ceiling for this card is quite high, and as we were saying earlier, we're playing 9 copies of Sweeping Blow. It's an effect we really want access to, and playing even just Fractal Replication, copying a red Sweeping Blow is something we will be pretty happy to do a lot of the time.
I would say the only red card, well, there's 2 red cards that I'm a little bit dubious on. One of them, unfortunately, made my top 10 cards last week in Uprising, and that's Burn Them All. A viewer pointed out last week that Burn Them All's effect was only once per turn, when Somehow, when I was reading that card, I just completely overlooked that line of text and imagined that all of the Aether Ashwings and all the dragons were just going to be shooting all kinds of arcane damage and just coming in for one physical, one arcane, one physical, one arcane, one physical, one arcane all the time during the turn. And obviously now, after that helpful listener pointed it out, I understand it's only a once per turn effect, and I am much lower on the card.
Like I was saying in our set review, I think it is powerful in the middle of the game. It does also fulfill Dromai's requirement of playing a red card, so you can play it and then use it as your way to enable your dragons to have go again. I think there will be times where it's pretty awkward. And one scenario I didn't even think about when we were talking about the card is if you ever don't attack with a dragon, the turn you have this in play, you're kind of like spewing value. And I think it's going to be a real thing that happens some of the time where you're just attacking with a couple illusionist attack actions and you actually don't attack with a dragon some turns.
I'm glad I've come back down to reality on this card now that I learned how to read a little bit better. But going back to the other red card that I think is a little bit dubious in the list is Scar for a Scar. I understand that there's a high need for red go again attack actions, and Dromai's actually looking to be more aggressive than Prism was overall. I just think maybe those 4 cards can be better suited for being maybe different blues or something like that, because I can definitely see situations and matchups where she's going to want those additional resources.
Yeah, that makes sense. Scar for a Scar isn't a card that I'm super thrilled to include in the deck, but again, the need for 0-cost go-agains, it does fill that role. And although we don't want pitching reds to be our plan when playing Dromai, it's not the worst if it happens a couple times over the course of a game. It's much better for Dromai to pitch a red than it is for another hero, because she does get that Ash as kind of a rebate. So when the Scar for a Scar is turned off, you are able to pitch it. Not that that's a great reason to include it, and it wouldn't surprise me if the later more refined versions of Dromai are cutting Scar for a Scar for, like you said, more resources or even another powerful red attack, but it made my list for those reasons.
Moving on to our equipment, I think one of the most interesting things about this new Illusionist is the more I think about it, the more I don't think Phantasmal Footsteps will be anywhere near as good or as necessary for this Illusionist as they were for Prism. Frequently, Prism was playing cards on their opponent's turn with these large instant speed auras she was casting, so if there was ever an additional resource, she would find times to activate her boots and block with it just to get free recursive block value out of them, and I think that was one of the main reasons to be playing them, even more so outside of being able to recover your action point after Phantasm triggers. So I think Dromai's going to use the block ability off of Phantasmal Footsteps nowhere near the amount of times per game that Prism was activating it, and I even think the cost of needing an additional resource to get your action point back after Phantasm is also a lot higher in a deck like Dromai.
Yeah, I agree. Dromai does not have a lot of resources lying around, and even the turns that she pitches a blue for her curve, she does have a real amount of cards that cost 2 or even 3 resources, that if she's playing a 1-cost go again card into something that costs 2 resources, that's going to use the whole blue. So if they pop, for example, the Spears of Surreality or the Dunebreaker Centipede, it's going to hurt her curve to have to pay that 1 extra resource to get her action point back. Unfortunately, there are not a lot of strong boots in the game, especially at generic, and Phantasmal Footsteps are the only legendary boot option Dromai has access to, and I think they still do enough to warrant playing them over the lower rarity cards. But if at some point we get a strong pair of generic boots or another strong pair of illusionist boots or some kind of draconic legendary boots, it wouldn't surprise me if Dromai looks to switch boots.
And then, speaking of gaps in equipment with no strong options in boots, there's also no strong legendary generic options for arms, and to that end, we're seeing Dash's favorite common equipment arm pieces in Goliath Gauntlets making an appearance here in this Dromai list, and there are legendary illusionist arms, but I don't think they are relevant in Dromai, because even with the Phantasm maybe occurring a little bit more often, because this card doesn't care about attack action cards being destroyed with Phantasm, it just cares about attacks being destroyed with Phantasm. Her paying those 3 resources at the end of the game in order to attack with these seems like a pretty tall order.
It definitely is. The good news is that when you're getting to second cycle, that's when you're going to have more blues probably. And I think in a lot of matchups that go long, you'll play the Ghostly Touch gloves as just another threat in the late game that will likely just come in as somewhere between 5 and 8 power Phantasm go again for 3 resources on the second cycle. And while that's not amazing, that's definitely a real threat. And if they don't have the popper the first turn, getting to do it again and again is something that's going to be not horrible. But like you were saying, it's not particularly strong. And in games that are short, they'll be not very useful at all, and that's why we also have the Goliath Gauntlet here.
Crown of Reflections also make an appearance again, but that's because it's just strictly better than Null Rune Hood. I don't think the activated ability will matter pretty much at all in this deck. It rarely even came up in Prism, where she had, zero cost auras she wanted to be putting into play and spectral shields laying around in order to facilitate that. I don't imagine Dromai really being able to utilize its activated ability, but it's just strictly better Null Rune Hood, no harm, no foul.
Yeah, strictly better Null Rune Hood, and it's not zero. There's not no chance you would use the ability, specifically if you have a blue heavy hand where you have Pierce Reality or Passing Mirage that you don't really need for resources, and you have a Burn Them All in play that is about to go away because you're running out of cards in your graveyard. You could use the Crown of Reflection to kill your Burn Them All and put one of your auras into play without using your action point up to buff an attack that turn.
I just don't think, given that she only has 6 of those zero-cost blue auras, and we envision her being more resource-hungry, that ability is really going to come up over the course of the game, but I could be wrong. Moving on, we have the last legendary piece of equipment that Dromai is going to be looking to play, the new premier headpiece that I think all the heroes are going to be gravitating towards over Arcanite Skullcap, which is Crown of Providence. So Dromai being able to use this in a key spot to block, filter her hand, everybody loves it, everybody's going to want it, everybody's going to need it.
Yeah, Dromai, especially with her really low blue count, if she draws an awkward hand that has two cost red cards or 2 cost red card in one of the big dragons and no blues, she'll definitely be very happy to have that filter ability, be able to put one of those expensive cards on the bottom, and hopefully draw either another zero cost card or a resource card to help pay for the other one.
Anything else you want to say about Dromai before we move on to Icelander?
Yeah, real quick, I do want to talk about the chess piece. It might look weird to play Spring Tunic over Flamescale Furnace because Flamescale Furnace is so synergistic with pitching reds. But again, I think that's just something you don't want to do that often. Any turn you're pitching 2 reds to really enable the Flamescale Furnace's ability to net 1 resource is a turn you're not very happy about. And I think Dromai's games are going to go reasonably long with playing some of these disruptive dragons, and if your opponent isn't interacting with you or attacking your dragons, you're probably just going to kill them quite quickly. So I imagine most opponents will at least be forced to send some of their attacks at her dragons if they aren't blocking them with 6 power attacks to pop them. And because of that, I think Fyendal Spring Tunic, you're going to get multiple resources out of it, and a lot of her turns function reasonably well off just a single resource. Like playing one of these 1-cost go-again attacks into attacking with dragons or several 0-cost cards is something that Dromai would be happy to have a turn doing. And the Fyendal Spring Tunic just kind of insulates you against the low resource count of the deck.
I think, unfortunately, there's just a lot of deck building constraints and considerations that Dromai needs. So not only is she probably going to wind up being one of the hardest heroes in all of Flesh and Blood to build successfully, given the complexity of everything she's trying to pull off in her deck, she also clearly has some gaps in her equipment right now. Even if we're granting that her chess piece is functional and good in her deck, we're clearly needing better slots in arms and boots as well to shore up some of her weaknesses. Maybe she'll get something in the supplemental set, but I still think she'll be a powerful player in the meta and something that somewhat needs to be accounted for going forward. But like I said, she's just going to be one of the trickier heroes to kind of figure out.
It was really interesting trying to build a deck for her, not knowing exactly how the dragons are going to play. I think that numbers on dragons, the amount of dragons you want to have, maybe you need less because there isn't enough Ash creation, or maybe you can get away with playing more. It'll be really interesting to see where everything lines up at the end.
Last but certainly not least, let's move on to Icelander now. In the exact opposite fashion of the 2 Draconic heroes who want to be super red heavy, Icelander wants to be super blue heavy. So she has the inverse of the interesting deck building decisions of trying to figure out how many reds she wants in her deck to get these powerful wizard effects versus having all of these blue cards in her list in order to have the resources to activate her Waning Moon Rod to deal the arcane damage, as well as just play the cards on her opponent's turn.
Due to her ability of, if it's not your turn, you may play blue non-attack action cards from your arsenal as though they were an instant. Because of that ability, she's going to be playing blue cards more often than other heroes are really looking to play blue cards. And so when you're trying to play a lot of your blue cards and use them as your resources, you just need a very high blue count to facilitate that.
So thankfully, there are just a lot of all-star blue she has access to, where before we've seen these ice cards dominating decks like Oldheim and Lexi with Blizzard, Channel Lake Frigid, but she also got the new updates with cards like Frost Hex and Insidious Chill that give her even more options to have powerful, disruptive blue ice actions to be able to put into our arsenal. However, there are also some interesting generic cards that maybe haven't had that much impact on Flesh and Blood overall, but I think could be particularly good in Icelander. And first and foremost, let's talk about This Round's on Me.
Yeah, so This Round's on Me has never been an exceptionally impressive card. Because you're letting each hero draw a card, this card is replacing itself but also giving the opponent a card. So in order for this card to be worth it, they need to be attacking you with quite a few cards normally. And if you start your turn by playing This Round's on Me, they can sequence their blocks differently, knowing that all their attacks are getting shrunk. And it's just hard for this card to be quite worth it a lot of the time. But with Icelander, as you can play it from your arsenal, it both turns on your Waning Moon, and your opponent doesn't know they're going to be under the effect of This Round's on Me until after you've played it. So presumably after they've taken their first action of the turn. Because of that unknown, that element of surprise it has, I think the effect that it has on the game state will be a lot more powerful.
I think it's also going to be fairly common where she's going to play other cards and have this floating resource available to her that can just cycle and get her to more powerful effects in the deck as well. So there's going to be instances where she can just play this at the end of her opponent's turn in order to set up almost like a Crown of Seeds situation where she's just paying that resource in order to put one of her arsenal cards back into her hand in order to facilitate more options on her turn as well. And when she does that, it completely nullifies the downside of the card because your opponent was about to draw to all of their cards in their hand anyways, and obviously you aren't getting the benefit of the minus power on your attacks, but if they're not playing a deck where that ability would have been particularly relevant anyways, it still makes the card worth it to play in that matchup.
Yeah, that's something I really hadn't considered. It's really interesting if your opponent has an arsenal and they're passing their turn, maybe they've used their action point or something. You can pitch a blue, use This Round's on Me, and use Waning Moon in response before the This Round's on Me resolves. And they'll draw a card, but they won't be able to use that card to pay for Arcane Barrier to stop the Waning Moon damage or anything. And then they'll just have to pass because they'll have a card in hand and a card in arsenal.
I think it'll just be a really interesting card in the deck, and I'm excited that it's finally potentially going to have its place in the meta. Moving on to the Reds, though, we have Michael Hamilton's favorite card in all of Flesh and Blood. I'm surprised he didn't rate this number one on his top 10 list. We have Enlightened Strike making an appearance in some of her red slots. Do you want to talk about Enlightened Strike, Michael?
Yeah, so Enlightened Strike does quite a few things for the deck. First, 0 for 5 draw a card that you tuck a card to play. You're breaking even in cards, just the one card for the Enlightened Strike. The card you are getting rid of is coming back. I think this ability is going to be quite strong in Icelander because almost all of your cards you're happy to arsenal. Your reds you're happy to arsenal, most of your blues you're happy to arsenal. There's very few cards in her deck that she does not want to arsenal, and because of that, that mode is almost always just going to be a 0 for 5, which is a great deal. On top of that, it blocks for 3, and it can help when your hands are rather red heavy. As we said before, this deck wants to have a lot of blues, and Enlightened Strike just helps fix red heavy hands.
It also gives her more of a way to deal alternative sources of damage if people are really packing that Arcane Barrier in order to mitigate her arcane damage. So having at least some ways to have some sources of physical damage could help push some unexpected damage that your opponent may not be considering. Next, we could talk about one of her more powerful sideboard options, which also hasn't seen a lot of play, or at least the Kano decks at the Pro Tour weren't including this card. There are 3 copies of Scour that I assume are for trying to shore up that Prism matchup that's looking to be somewhat difficult for this hero to deal with.
Yeah, Scour is a great sideboard option against Prism. The fact that you can play it instant speed means Prism's basically never safe to attack you with a Spectral Shield if you have a card in Arsenal. Because if they do, then you can cast Scour and kill it, and they'll lose their action point because the go again will never resolve or will not resolve before it dies. On top of that, you don't really want to be sending attack actions at the blue auras very often. It's just not super efficient, and Scour is a nice clean way that you can clean up multiple copies of blue auras for the cost of 1 single action point in a card.
Right, so the bigger auras that cost 4 or more, although I don't know why she would be playing Artlight Sentinel against Icelander, but who knows. But it can't hit those cards, obviously, but being able to clean up the blue auras that Prism is usually playing all 12 copies of in her list is quite nice. And then I guess just we can talk about rounding out the deck list. We just kind of have a lot of solid role player blue cards that are ice, cards like Aether Hail just trying to chip in for some arcane damage, Aether Ice Vein, other cyclers like Polar Blast or Cold Snap that are just looking to satisfy that requirement of playing both a blue card and an ice card on your opponent's turn, giving them that frostbite and replacing themselves.
And also revealing for the several ice fusion effects too.
Yeah, absolutely. Can't forget about those. So I think she is overall actually a bit easier to build than the other Draconic heroes, or at least easier to build than Dromai. But I still think there's going to be a lot of different iterations on this deck that we're going to see over the course of the meta.
I agree. I think that over time, her deck will evolve as it learns what it needs to do to beat some of its tougher matchups, and it learns what cards it can do without, even it gets its more favored matchups and keep them still favorable.
I guess moving on to the equipment, is this a typo, Michael? Why are Goliath gauntlets once again appearing in the arm slot?
Well, as we were saying before, there are not very many strong arm slots at all that currently exist in the game. At Generic, Wizards has access to Metacarpus nodes, but unfortunately for Icelander, she's not really able to capitalize on Metacarpus nodes because most turns she's only playing one source of arcane damage. So a one-time ability of paying one extra resource for one extra arcane damage is not a rate that you're very happy about. So we do have 3 copies of Command and Conquer, and the main use of Goliath Gauntlet is going to be sacrificing Goliath Gauntlet and playing a Command and Conquer for 8. A lot of decks are not going to be prepared for Command and Conquer, especially since a lot of blocking armor is going to be sideboarded out against Wizards in favor of armor that has Arcane Barrier. So you can really catch them off guard with a Command and Conquer, and pumping it up to 8 is just a nice break point. That said, if we get some better generic arms, I think Icelander would be very happy to play something else in that slot.
What about Ironhide arms? Why doesn't she want the block?
Ironhide arms would be fine. I think that 0 for 2 is better than 1 for 2, but I think Ironhide arms are better than Qual 1 gloves. I would guess Goliath Gauntlet's better if you're playing CNC anyway. If you're cutting Goliath Gauntlet, maybe you cut the CNCs and then you play Ironhide, and that seems fine to me too.
So out of all of her other pieces of equipment, at least she has good legendary wizard legs that are going to be allowing her to play her non-attack wizard actions at instant speed, either on their opponent's turn or on her turn, since they don't intrinsically have go again most of the time. So at least there's that.
Yeah, I actually don't think Storm Striders are even that strong in Icelander, since you're not doing any of the combo stuff that Kano was trying to do. They are just the best option, and 1 resource for an action point at a surprise time essentially is what it is at the cost of your boots is fine. And then Arcane Barrier 2 is also quite nice.
Right, being able to soak up those pesky Rosetta Thorn swings. Although I expect the Rune Blades to be kind of the decks that a disruptive Frostbite based deck like Icelander to already sort of dunk on anyways, but I guess you can dunk even harder on the Rune Blades, so that's always nice. And then if we're going to look at her headpiece, what matchups do you think she's going to want Coronet Peak, Michael?
The only one I included in the list was Coronet Peak, but I could see that being wrong and also wanting the Crown of Providence. But Coronet Peak's the ability to use your action point and 3 resources to force the opposing hero to discard a card unless they pay 1. It's something that's going to come up a lot. She doesn't need her action point that often. If she plays a relatively defensive turn, she can just activate Coronet Peak on her turn and arsenal another blue or something. And that's pretty nice against a lot of the heroes that are looking to play 4 or 5 card hands as much as possible, especially if they have damage that doesn't increase linearly based on the amount of cards they have. An example would be Rune Blades needing the non-attack and the attack action to turn on Rosetta Thorn to get a big chunk of damage very efficiently.
Yeah, I can definitely get behind that reasoning. And then I guess moving on to maybe how we expect this deck to iterate more in the future, I think the potions are kind of hard to evaluate in any wizard. Well, Kano is usually pretty happy to play them. I don't know how happy Icelander will be to play them. She can play them at instant speed from her arsenal on her opponent's turn, but with a card like Time Snap Potion, it's hard to see how relevant that would be. But Energy Potion also is a little bit awkward because essentially you're just arsenaling a card to get 2 resources when the card pitches for 3 resources anyways. I guess being able to save those resources for a future turn and it cleanly activating her staff is nice, but we'll see if those cards find a home in Icelander or not.
Yeah, we'll have to see if there's like some kind of way you can build her to be more combo-y. If there is, I could definitely see her wanting more of the potions because if her damage scales exponentially with the more things she does in a turn, then being able to play these potions without using her action point is a pretty nice upside.
Ultimately, I think what would hinder a more combo-y Icelander is the fact that Kano, with his activated ability on his hero power, is able to just see more cards and just tear through his deck at a faster rate than Icelander would be able to do. But who knows, maybe it would be a more condensed combo with a specific hand setup that you would be able to pull off with just 4 or 5 cards and generating insane amounts of Frostbites with those. Okay, now that we've discussed all the Uprising heroes, let's talk about the Uprising Classic Constructed meta as a whole. Ready, Michael?
I'm ready.
So Michael and I both went to just the standard tier maker website and ranked all of the class constructed heroes that will be legal once Uprising is released. So obviously Bravo, star of the show, and Chain will be living legend out and no longer a part of the metagame. That is going to dramatically shake up the evaluations and the hero rankings from every other class constructed season that comes beforehand, even without these new Uprising heroes joining the fray. So S is going to be the most powerful, and then going all the way down to D tier heroes who we expect to be the least powerful. So, Michael, how many heroes did you put in your S tier?
There's only one hero in my S tier. I think she is definitely the deck to beat going forward this season, and I only put Prism in my S tier for that reason. I think Prism has been doing quite well for basically since she got printed, putting up reasonable results against Chain, putting up reasonable results against Bravo, star of the show. Prism has proven to be very resilient, even when the aggressive Plunder Run Briar decks were on the top of the metagame. Prism still took down New Zealand Nationals and just proves that she is a deck that is very powerful, very resilient, and in my opinion, warrants her place at the top of the tier list.
Yeah, I completely agree, and that's why she's also the only hero in my S tier as well. The more I think about it, the more and more I'm excited for Prism to actually living legend out of the game. I really like Prism, and I made it to the finals in the last ProQuest season playing her. I think she has a really unique and interesting gameplay, and has a lot of really rewarding and deep lines that she can take with her different playstyles between the auras and herald plans. But ultimately, I just think the amount of constraints Spectra puts on decks in their deck building decisions, and just stopping people from playing the game or just lose to this onslaught of never-ending value that they just generate for free every turn, I think ultimately has proven to be a little bit much in the long run for Flesh and Blood. And I think we see that given just how dramatically different Dromai is going to play to Prism, where her dragon allies are allies and not just these weird auras that sit on the battlefield that have Spectra. Not to harp on it too much, but Spectra is just my least favorite keyword in Flesh and Blood. It just leads to so many nightmare rule situations to where, well, do your rune chants pop when you play a card, or do they not pop when they play a card, or when does this card become attacking or not attacking, and do fuse triggers happen when you attack a Spectra? I don't know. I ask judges all these questions during all my time during competitive play. And just given the fact that I'm clearly, and Michael is clearly, more entrenched than 90% of people who ever play Flesh and Blood and still get tripped up on how complicated this keyword is, I think just demonstrates how poorly it's played out in Flesh and Blood as a whole.
Yeah, even moving past the rules nightmare that is Spectra, just the way that Prism taxes sideboards is also very weird in that the cards that you play for Prism are only applicable for Prism. Many decks are playing cards like Lead the Charge specifically because when you attack something with Spectra, your Go Again does not resolve. So you need to have ways to create action points outside of Go Again to be able to clear out multiple Spectra auras in a turn. On top of that, she also has the very unique demand of you need cards that have 6 power so that you can pop her attacks that have Phantasm. And Dromai is going to require you to have 6 power attacks if you want to pop her Phantasm effects, but she's only going to push you to have one specific kind of sideboard card, whereas Prism had 2 specific kind of sideboard card.
And to a certain extent, 3, if you're considering yellow cards, if she ever decides to pick up more library versions again, because for as much as her long, grindy matchups are already skewed in her favor, when she has a library in play, they become even more lopsided in her favor and pretty close to just unlosable.
Yeah, so I'm really looking forward to seeing what the metagame will look like once Prism Living Legends out. Her both power and her demands on the metagame and what people have to do to try to beat her are something that has been format warping since she's been printed, and it'll be very cool to see a format without her.
And so to that end, speaking of a warped format, I think the decks that are going to best be able to compete against Prism are going to be these hyper aggressive decks that try to get under the auras and prevent her from generating her long-term value over the course of a game. So that's why, moving down to A tier, I put Phi Rising Rebellion as my top tier A hero. I think Phi is just going to be the premier aggro deck in Flesh and Blood. He just seems to have a lot of the same characteristics that we've seen in Runeblade, such as Briar and Chain, playing these really long combat chains, just pushing a lot of damage and really threatening on hit triggers. So that's why I think it's just going to be a lot for a deck like Prism to handle, where she's still only going to have access to 3 to 4 cards in her hand in a turn that block effectively, and a lot of the time she's going to have 1 to 2 auras in that hand that just don't block at all, allowing these aggro decks to really push even more damage than they would be able to against other decks.
Yeah, Fi brought with him a ton of very powerful ninja cards, draconic cards, and it looks like it's going to be very cohesive with a lot of very powerful cards. On top of that, I think Fi has a solid argument for having the best equipment suite in the game between Mask of Momentum and Tiger Stripe Shuko. Fi's equipment is very powerful and is going to have an effect on most turns of the game, which is not something you can say about a lot of other heroes.
It's probably close. I still think I give the edge to Runeblades just because Spellbound Creepers, being legendary boots, are far and away better than anything Fi has access to, but I do agree that overall his equipment is extremely powerful. Moving on, any other heroes in your A tier, Michael?
Let's talk about the 3 aggressive heroes, then I'll get to my last inclusion, but let's wrap up the aggressive heroes first.
Sure. I guess also in my A tier I have Lexi, and I'm thinking more of the electric build of Lexi, more so than her ice build. I don't think her ice build, even with the addition of these new ice cards in Uprising, will be particularly able to compete with more controlling decks than her, like Prism or Oldhim. And I think she then would just be playing a disruptive game that would not be as disruptive as the other ice heroes like Oldhim and Icelander at that point, and even to a certain degree Prism. So it just is a weird way for the deck to be built. So in the A tier, Lightning Lexi, though, is able to push absurd amounts of damage, and I think has been kind of underrepresented in aggressive decks so far. And then Briar, Warden of Thorns, also being the traditional very aggressive deck that Prism has struggled into in the past.
Touching on Lexi a little bit, I think Ice Lexi is very interesting because it's reasonably favored against these other aggressive decks, but it doesn't really stand much of a chance against the decks that are happy to block her out anyway. The reason it's so powerful is because you both disrupt them and you have these threatening on-hits that are going to further disrupt them and also deal a reasonable amount of damage. Against these aggro decks that don't want to block, it's just very powerful. And the only thing, the reason it's not been dominant in the metagame, in my opinion, is that it really struggles into Prism and it really struggles into the controlling Guardian decks.
And not even the controlling Guardian decks. It really struggled into Bravo, star of the show, who wasn't necessarily a controlling deck, but just Bravo having access to these blues and then his own extremely disruptive, extremely punishing on-hit triggers. And Lexi is a hero that just never wants to block. She's just really looking to utilize every single card she has access to between the 2 cards in her arsenal and the 4 cards in her hand. She just needs so many resources in order to do either her ice or lightning strategies. It just really wasn't super viable when there were heroes like Bravo, star of the show around.
Yeah, even Lightning Lexi also struggled a lot into Bravo star of the show, not being able to significantly disrupt him, as well as just being very vulnerable to his on-hits, made that matchup very tough for Lexi.
If only you had Ball Lightning, you could have had cards that made you block even worse into that matchup. If only.
One other thing Lexi also struggles with that I think is probably the main reason that I think she is not in S tier is Lexi, unfortunately, is very held back by her equipment. Her gloves are bullseye bracers, which aren't useless, but are not very impressive gloves. And her boots, she also usually runs either Purge Grapplers or Snapdragon Scalers, which are also both reasonably worse than what a lot of heroes have access to. Her hat is strong with New Horizon. And then for her chest piece, I was talking about how Fi had a huge upgrade in getting this chest piece that blocks for 3 in games that are going not very many turns. And Lexi, unfortunately, does not have any option like that. She's forced to basically play Fyendal Spring Tunic, but in all of her aggro mirrors, it's very unlikely to even get more than 1 activation out of it. And sometimes you don't even get that first activation, depending on the matchup. Rounding out my A tier, I have Oldhim, specifically because I think he lines up very well against these 3 aggressive heroes. I think if these 3 aggressive heroes do kind of push Prism down in the metagame, Oldhim can shine. If Prism's ever like 20% of the metagame and most of its aggressive heroes, then you can reasonably bring Oldhim and expect to do well as long as you are fortunate enough to avoid the Prism matchup. Unfortunately, there's not much that you can do to build Oldhim in a way that can compete with Prism, and you're likely going to struggle from a very bad matchup even if you devote many sideboard slots to it. That might be worth it if you think Prism is not going to be a huge percentage of the field and you can just hope to dodge the ones that do show up.
Right. Given how prevalent I expect Prism to be, and given how bad the Oldhim into Prism matchup is, wound up dropping him down to B tier on my tier list. But I do agree with your assessment that he is lurking in the shadows waiting to beat up on all of these aggressive decks. So that's why I kind of started as level 0 or level 1 being Prism. So the base deck, then there are the decks that beat the base deck. So that's level 2, the aggressive decks. And then level 3 would be the decks that beat the deck that beat the deck. So That's how I built my tier list.
All right, shall I move on to B tier then?
Go for it.
All right, at the top of my B tier, I have Dromai. This one is kind of speculative. I think that it is likely that she struggles a bit into the Prism matchup, specifically the interaction with Herald of Erudition. Being able to hit one of her dragons and immediately draw 2 cards seems very powerful and like something that will be tough for Dromai to recover from. But she does have a few things going for her. If you attack with Chromai, you can end up with 2 action points, which, as we were talking about with Lead the Charge, is something that's very important into Prism because you can then attack twice at 2 Spectral Auras and clear 2 from the battlefield in 1 turn. On top of that, I think that she's a huge unknown in that we don't actually know a lot of how her matches will play. And currently, with sideboard slots being split between needing Lead the Charges and poppers against Prism, that means there may be less poppers for Dromai to fight against. And I think that some of her cards are very powerful, and if there are not too many Phantasm poppers, that Dromai could be a real force to reckon with.
She's really hard to evaluate, and that's why I didn't put her in my B tier. I just don't know how important or impactful Prism being able to attack dragons and get her powerful Herald hit triggers on. So every single Herald that hits a dragon is going to go into Prism Soul, and she's going to get all the on-hit triggers, specifically looking at Herald of Erudition being just a complete blowout when it hits a dragon. Just being able to kill the dragon, draw 2 cards, and just reset her turn from there could really hamper Dromai's ability to keep a lot of dragons on the board. But that being said, I could definitely see her being powerful. I just didn't know how to evaluate her given how unsure I even was when thinking about building your deck to begin with. Also, being unsure how to build her also puts me into a place where I'm unsure what else will sit in the meta, and that's why she didn't wind up making my B tier. The first hero that did make my B tier, though, is my personal favorite Runeblade, but I think is just now a step slower than all the other Runeblades in the aggressive decks due to the banning of Skeletta, which is Viserai. Viserai can dunk on Prism, I think, more effectively than any other deck that plays his kind of playstyle, especially for him not being as aggressive. His Arknight Ascensions and other cards like Runic Reclamation just give him innate poppers that he's happy to play with, and is able to effectively weave attack actions and non-attack actions in order to effectively handle the aura strategies as well, especially if he's turning to cards like Lead the Charge in order to generate action points regardless of what he's doing. He just, in my experience, has just been overwhelmingly favored into Prism. It's just his struggle into the other aggressive decks and the rest of the field in general is why he didn't quite make my A tier.
Viserai can be built to prey on Prism a little bit with, like you said, a lot of poppers and many ways to generate action points. Spellbound Creepers is also a card that cannot be overlooked as a way to create 2 action points in a turn or create an extra action point in a turn. Along with that, he also can use Rosetta Thorn to attack and aura, and then because of his ability to create Rune Chance, if he plays another attack action that is attacking an aura, the Rune Chance will still threaten to keep his Spellbound Creepers around, which means that he has access to Spellbound Creepers more turns than the other Runeblades would in the Prism matchup.
Or inversely, if he wants to pop an aura and keep his Rune Chance around, attacking with that weapon importantly doesn't pop the Rune Chance and allows him to be those cost reduction resources going into his next turn as well.
One other perk that Viserai has going for him, on the turns, if a Prism Arclight Sentinels you and you do not have Lead the Charge to create an extra action point when you kill it, you can still generate some value that turn by playing a couple of non-attack actions and creating Rune Chance from Viserai's ability, so that your turn's not a complete wash when you get Arclight Sentinel.
Very true. After Viserai, I put Icelander, once again being a deck that beats the decks that beat Prism. I think the Icelander matchup is going to be very difficult for the more aggressive Runeblade and Ninja decks that are going to try to go under Prism. Just her ability to obviously generate frostbites, be disruptive, and really tax the decks in ways that they don't want to be taxed, I think could give her a really solid place in the metagame if it skews too aggressive in one direction.
Yeah, I agree with that. The fact that she can beat up on these aggressive decks that want to play 4 or 5 card hands, like we were talking about earlier with Coronet Peak, and then her ability to give frostbites, it's just very potent against these aggressive decks. On top of that, Scour does give her some tools to fight against Prism. It's likely is still going to be an unfavored matchup, but Scour is a very powerful tool that you can use to blow out some Prisms if they're not expecting it.
Any other heroes on your B list?
The last one on my B list is Bolton.
B is for Bolton.
I think Bolton has been more represented in other countries in the United States, and I think we haven't really given him a lot of respect here. Rogers had some success playing Bolton in Orlando during the Plunder on Briar metagame, where he was just Saber's comboing all the Briars and really kind of proved that Saber's Boltyn is very potent against these aggro decks that aren't really threatening a lot of on-hits. And even when they are, Boltyn has access to a lot of powerful equipment to block them out with. And if you aren't packing the disruption for it and you aren't killing him fast enough, which is very hard to do, he builds up the combo quite quickly, it's definitely a very potent combo. And on top of that, with Raiden being a 0-cost weapon, the only one in the game that actually attacks as far as I know, you can use Raiden to clear an aura with spending 0 cards on it against Prism, which means potentially there's room for a build of Boltyn that uses Saber's combo against the aggressive decks and Raiden plus probably some lead the charges against Prism. And Boltyn also naturally plays a reasonable amount of poppers with Celestial Cataclysm and Bolting Blade. So I think there's potential that he could have reasonable matchups into the aggro decks and also a reasonable matchup into Prism. And that's something that kept me from putting him any lower on my list, even though his results so far haven't been stellar.
I think Saber's combo into the Rune Blades, it's really easy to fall into a pattern where you're blocking with 1 to 2 cards and then using the other 2 cards to just put that card into a soul. So you're netting taking about 5-ish damage a turn, but as long as that 5 damage isn't also creating additional on-hit value for the Rune Blades or ninjas where they're drawing extra cards or generating resources through other means, however that would happen, he's just fine to take that damage until he's ready to combo off, because his combo just regains him that around 20 life usually when he goes off, and then puts the Rune Blades on the back foot for us the game, which is a place where they never want to be, given how card hungry they are to want to be playing those non-attack actions and attack actions, or in Fi's case wanting to push as many cards as he can on the combat chain. So that's why, in my experience, the Saber combo matchup has been quite favorable into these more aggressive decks, but we'll have to see how that plays out in the Uprising meta. I did play some on my B tier as well, though, for all the reasons we just discussed, and he is one of my favorite heroes in the game overall. That's all on my B tier. Okay, so those are the top 3 tiers, our S, A, and B tier heroes that Michael and I considered. If your favorite hero didn't make our top 3 spots in the expected metagame, don't worry. Believe it or not, Michael and I have been known to have been wrong once or twice in our lives, so maybe we're overlooking something or not evaluating one of these other heroes' strategies or card pools correctly in the upcoming meta. And that's also not to say that these heroes won't have more of a time to shine once Prism Living Legends out of the game, which, given that she's at over 800 points at the moment, is looking like it's going to be sooner than later. So any other things you want to say about the rest of the hero pools that we didn't talk about in our first 3 tiers, Michael?
Yeah, I do want to give a quick shout out to the 2 brutes. Both Reinhardt and Levia they both could potentially be built in a way to have a reasonable Prism matchup. And I think Reinhardt has a lot of game against Oldheim if that deck ends up being one of the most popular ones. And I think Levia can roll with some of the aggro decks when her draws line up well. So I think they're both reasonable choices as well. And they're not the heroes that I would be looking to build, but I wouldn't be shocked to see good results from either of them.
That definitely makes sense. I think the other reason why they didn't make my top 3 tiers as well, where we're looking at the decks that beat up on the aggressive decks as well, where Reinhardt's ability in particular with the Intimidate that he's threatening turn after turn doesn't really impact the decks that don't want to block anyways, and Prism can just play her auras in response to the Intimidate triggers anyways. That being said, I still think he has a reasonable matchup into Prism, not amazing, but obviously has access to a lot of poppers. He's just not the best into all the other aggressive decks in the format at the moment, in my opinion. So we'll have to see. Well, thank you very much for listening, everybody. We really appreciate it. Let us know if we're overlooking something either in the Uprising deck building for the new heroes or in our evaluations of the meta. Remember to like and subscribe, click that bell button, and next time you're playing Flesh and Blood, always remember, mind your manners. We'll see you next time.